Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session of the Island Finance Forum 2023. Hopefully, you've been to some sessions before, and so as you know, a poll will shortly be appearing on your screen where you can tell us a little bit more about yourself so we have an idea of who's joining, where you're from, and what you're looking to learn from this session. I'm delighted that in this session we have a fantastic panel led by the moderator, Joanna Robinson from PwC Eastern Caribbean, who is joining me on screen now. And we'll be hearing from government representatives from Jamaica, Anguilla, St. Kitts and Nevis, as well as legal representatives from Trinidad and Tobago. It's going to be a fantastic session. I can see now that we have a mix of participants from the Caribbean, Europe, and Africa, also Asia and the Pacific. About half of you are from the private sector and 20% from government, and then really a mixture of the finance, energy, and economic development industries. So a good mix in this session. Do go ahead and drop a note in the chat so we know where you're coming from. And also, as always, there is a Q&A box there. You can submit any questions and we will try, no promises, but we'll try and get to some of those questions when possible in the discussion section. So without further ado, Joanna, thank you so much for leading the session, and over to you.
Thank you so much. No, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to all of you from all over the world to the panel discussion today, the evolution of ESG, the future of sustainable development policy. So today we're going to have a deep discussion on the current and future state environmental, social, and governance legislation, and how that is supporting and aligned to sustainable policy. So we won't be focusing on pie in the sky. Our panel of experts will discuss active policies and legislation in the pipeline, as well as the importance of both local legislation and external global regulations. They'll also be highlighting the key drivers behind ESG adoption and implementation in the Caribbean, and what they see is driving us towards a more sustainable development goal and an agenda. Now, as mentioned, I'm Joanna Robinson. I'm the consulting partner and international development agency specialist for PwC East Caribbean. I'm normally based in the beautiful island of Barbados. I'm currently speaking to you from Antigua, which is equally stunning and feels like my second home. But I also have a third home. I spent the last year and a half working with PwC Ghana and with clients across West Africa, in Kenya, and in South Africa. And while I was there, I had the opportunity to work on developing detailed SDG investor maps for target industry sectors and specific districts in Ghana. So doing that research really helped me to think about how we can go deeper into the broad themes, go beyond that, so we can identify real, viable investment opportunities. And that really helped drive home the fact that government and private sector need to work in lockstep to drive the sustainable development agenda. So while we in the private sector can seek out opportunities that have significant potential to advance the SDGs, while we can implement ESG policies, if they're not aligned to the overarching government policy, national sustainable development needs, and the commitments of the specific country, then the time frame within which we can see real impact can be much longer than we would prefer. Also, what we'll see is that the actual impact itself can be unpredictable. And similarly, if there is no private sector input and buy-in, it can be difficult for government to advance the sustainable development agenda. So with that in mind, I'm very pleased to introduce the panel, who represent a very wide cross-section of islands in the Caribbean, and also who have a great wealth of experience globally. Their backgrounds cover both public and private sector. We have lawmakers and a lawyer who have combined experience in environmental and social policy, community activism, education, marketing, and commercial law. We have Senator the Honorable Dr. Joel Clark, who is the Minister of Sustainable Development from St. Kitts and Nevis. From Jamaica to becoming, he hasn't been able to join us yet. We'll be joined later by the Honorable Matthew Samuda, who's the Minister in the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation in Jamaica. From Anguilla, I'm pleased to welcome the Honorable Quincia Gums-Marie, the Minister of Sustainability, Innovation, and the Environment in Anguilla. And from Trinidad and Tobago, but with a remit that covers the entire Caribbean region, we have Ms. Rachel Welch-Phillips, who is the head of ESG and Sustainable Finance in Denton's, Trinidad and Tobago. Now, obviously, ESG legislation and the frameworks that we have in place right now are more aligned to disclosure, and it's a great starting point. We know that what gets measured gets done in theory. So mandating the disclosure starts the conversation around the impact that organizations have on their environment and society. So what we will talk about today is how we are moving towards legislation that has real impact on sustainable development, how that conversation around policy, around ESG, how that is moving us towards real policy that affects sustainable development. So with that being said, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is Senator the Honourable Dr. Joelle Tricia-Clark, the Minister of Sustainable Development, Environment, Climate Action and Constituency Empowerment for St. Kitts and Nevis. Now, Senator Clark is easily described as a climate action advocate. She's a defender of youth involvement in decision-making and a climate and gender justice specialist. Professionally, she became one of the youngest women to become a director of a government office, and that was the Department of Constituency Empowerment in 2012. Shortly thereafter, Dr. Clark worked as an educator, bringing her passion for the environment and youth together under the banner of one of the strongest youth-led environmental programs in St. Kitts and Nevis, and that was the Keon High School Environmental Club. The members of that club became ambassadors for the students to a project called the St. Mary's UNESCO Man and the Biosphere Project, which allowed for even more advocacy and youth-led conservation work. Dr. Clark has been involved in social impact assessments and sustainable livelihoods research for over 15 years. So very pleased to pass the microphone over to you, Dr. Clark. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Joanna, and thank you. I must start by thanking the organizers for the inclusion and invitation to join such an auspicious panel. I really do look forward to very intense and provocative and useful discussion on the way forward for ESG legislation and sustainable development goals. I think it's important that I start always from a reality check, like where are we as Caribbean states, as small island developing states, as large ocean states, or as the global south, however we want to frame ourselves. And it's important to start, since I'm the first speaker, that the reality is the Caribbean states, we will continue to deal with and grapple with the 3 C's reality: the climate crisis, COVID-19 recovery, and conflict, which has led to increasing scarcity of goods and an increasing cost of global commodities, in particular, fuel. Another reality is how expensive it will be to achieve the SDGs by 2030. Some estimates are in the range of $5 to $7 trillion, an injection of $5 to $7 trillion for countries to achieve the SDGs. Now, with that said, the question is, where are we now? Where are we based on 2015 SDG goals? Where are we based on our Paris Agreement? Where are we based on our commitment to 1.5? Where are we based on the $100 billion threshold? And even where are we based on our acceptance of the establishment of a loss and damage fund at COP27? I pause here to also give thanks again to AOSIS for being a leading advocate for the establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund, AOSIS then chaired by Antigua and Barbuda. It is important to always assess where we are and determine how we can get to where we want to be by 2030 and how realistic it is without legislation, without climate finance, and also without investments from companies and industries that have the ESG as their framework for investment. I'm appreciative of the opportunity to always use what I call my intersectional position to speak on issues like this. I was an academic and an advocate and a youth advocate, and then a gender and female advocate, women's empowerment advocate, and now I'm a politician and I describe myself as a feminist. And from these varied lenses, it's always important to understand who are most impacted when we think about achieving the SDGs and the legislation, and ESG framework, and how do we protect the most vulnerable? How does the legislation support protection of the most vulnerable? How do we look at inclusion, diversity, environmental conservation, and governance structures which empower? The reality for St. Kitts and Nevis is we made a commitment last year to transform our island to a sustainable island state. And that was not a small commitment. That was a very new and young government saying to the people of St. Kitts and Nevis and to the world that we recognize our vulnerability. We recognize that most of our challenges are external, but we want to transform, and we recognize how expensive it would be to transition to a sustainable island state. We have committed to doing so through constitutional reform and through legislative amendment. Less than 6 months into government, we have already passed anti-corruption laws, integrity in public life, made banking amendments, and have committed to increasing and improving the ease of doing business in St. Kitts and Nevis. With that said, the legislative support is here to back sustainable investments and sustainable financing. But how do we attract sustainable financing? How do we ensure that the companies we invest with or the companies we invite to St. Kitts and Nevis to invest are using the ESG principles, or that we have legislation which mandates such? Our economy is particularly labor intensive. Most of the growth is concentrated in the tourism and construction industry. We do recognize that tourism, manufacturing, and manufacturing are women-led industries, and these industries are most susceptible to climate risk, and women and young girls in these industries are particularly vulnerable, hence the need for a gendered perspective in our transition to a sustainable island state and appropriate legislation to protect women. We realize that for St. Kitts and Nevis, these receipts, the income that we have from CBI, the Citizen by Investment Program, and investment migration has placed our country as a developed country, but the reality is not the same on the ground. We are not able to access overseas development aid. We are always excluded from conversation when it comes to aid. And that's a problem, not just for St. Kitts, but St. Kitts, Antigua, and Barbados. And that's a challenge here, that we echo the sentiments of other regional leaders for the need to move beyond the GDP indicators for aid and move towards the MVI, Multi-Vulnerability Index, in terms of accessing finance. There's also a recognition that until we can stimulate job growth outside of external factors such as connections to tourism, we are always going to be vulnerable. Our investment structures are always going to be vulnerable. So how do we move beyond that? And that's the question I want to ask today. How do we ensure that for St. Kitts and Nevis, there's appropriate legislation, there are corporate structures which are sensitive to the need for environmental, social, and governance framework? How do we ensure that climate finance is accessible, that we have the strategic partnerships needed to buffer St. Kitts and Nevis and other Caribbean states and transform our societies? So there's a need to focus on growth and resilience. There's a need to ensure that growth and resilience in St. Kitts and Nevis and in the Caribbean is actually private sector driven and private sector finance. We're not going to find $5 to $7 trillion globally in the public sector. We're not going to find it in government coffers. We're not going to find it anywhere else but in the investment structures in the private sector. And that's why public-private partnerships are critical. And that's why in St. Kitts and Nevis, we recognize the need to improve the ease of doing business in St. Kitts, to have legislation which supports anti-corruption and integrity in public life, and banking amendments which makes it easier for business to be conducted and for money transfers to be monitored. We also realized that we had to accept the intentional steps towards sustainability and legislation, not just moving from policy, but moving towards legislation to mandate principles of environmental protection and social inclusion and diversity. For example, we do have a challenge with water. And this is linked to the climate change. Now, if we're going to move to desalination, which we've not done yet, we can be very simple and say, yeah, we want a desal plant, and if it's generated by fossil fuel, it's okay. But we have been so intentional in our transformation to a sustainable island state that we are not accepting any projects or any bids or proposals that do not provide water through desalination without generation through renewable sources. That's not always easy for a small island state to do, for a small country whose income is dependent on overseas travel, which is then impacted by climate change and COVID-19. It's not always easy to be intentional about investments and industrial structures. There's also the need for strategic partnerships. And I echo again the sentiments of all regional leaders that the global South, G77, needs to progress to a point where we are comparable to G7. How does that happen? There is a need for the global North to commit to transfer of wealth, shifting power to the global South so that the world could be more equitable. There's a need for debt forgiveness and refinancing to be embedded in climate finance. And that's why I appreciate the Bridgestone agenda. There's no way that Caribbean SIDS can address centuries of debt, vulnerabilities, and exogenous shocks without there being some sort of debt forgiveness and refinancing through climate finance, and accepting that every step we take towards the SDGs in 2030 requires that intentional support from the global North. We commit ourselves to constitutional review and aligning ministries to our SDG goals, but we recognize the importance of the strategic partnerships of the global South and the support from the global North in achieving this agenda. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Clark. Really insightful presentation. Really appreciated hearing more about what's happening in St. Kitts and Nevis, and really took your point to heart that as we do address this conversation, we need to think about the people who are the most impacted and how we protect the most vulnerable. So thank you again, Dr. Clark. So our next speaker is the Honorable Quincia Gums-Marie. She's the Minister of Sustainable Innovation and the Environment in Anguilla. She was elected to public office in June 2020. And like most leaders across the world at that time who were now joining, the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic quickly tested her mettle. So in her immediate capacity as the Parliamentary Secretary of Information Technology, Natural Resources, Economic Development and Tourism, she quickly accepted the role of czar, jumpstarting the economy, hypercommunication, and the changing scenes of a world locked down by the unprecedented times. Now, Minister Gums-Marie is an environmentalist at heart. Her passion led to the creation of the Blue Anguilla Committee, also known as BANG, and July 2022 saw the creation of a new ministry within the government of Anguilla, which she now leads as the Honourable Minister of Sustainability, Innovation and the Environment. So she's got a large portfolio, and because it includes conservation, renewable energy development, climate change, food security, and information and communications technology. So Minister Gums-Marie, welcome. Really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on what's happening in Anguilla and beyond.
Well, good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's a timely conversation, and it reminds me of the importance of speaking to your peers, because in listening to the Honorable Dr. Clark, I said, is she in Anguilla? Does she know exactly what we're facing? And I guess that's just the reality of all small island states. When it comes to the evolution of ESG, I think we're all really familiar with the tenets of ESG, which to me can be summarized simply as asking companies to do the right thing. It's a means of ensuring corporate responsibility, not only to shareholders for profit, but to employees, to host communities and the world. It is an opportunity for us to demand more of the companies we do business with, the products we consume and the services we receive. Given the global challenges related to climate change, environmental degradation, inequality, stagnant economies, and lack of sustainable financing, which are particularly acute here in the Caribbean region, we have to speak up and demand more. Due to our small open economies, which are vulnerable to global shocks, our limited human resource capacity and financial resources, external, or as we call it in Anguilla, foreign direct investment, is a critical component of economic growth and resilience. However, traditionally, and even currently, when we conduct our due diligence investigations on potential investors, our focus is on two things. One, are they legit, meaning not engaged in any criminal activity? And two, do they have the money that they claim to have? And it's unfortunate that we have not concerned ourselves with their environmental footprints, their labor practices, or their corporate structure and management practices. When countries like ours seem to be in constant crisis, recovering from the devastation of a natural disaster, trying to combat coral death and rising sea temperature, dealing with the influx of sargassum on our shorelines, economic shutdown due to a pandemic, the unexpected health costs in managing the pandemic, rising prices due to external pressures and supply chain disruptions, which make access to essential goods and services more difficult for our population, it is easy to see why we solely focus on financial and reputational considerations. From a global perspective, though, we recognize that there is an increasing demand for ESG reporting and a growing legislative push for companies to be held accountable in relation to compliance with ESG requirements. This represents a golden opportunity for us, actually, when framing our investment policies, to not only consider sustainable financing from the perspective of its reliability and consistency, but from the perspective of whether it comes from a source that engages in sustainable practices underpinned by the pillars of ESG. In other words, given the impact of global challenges, and the fact that they are often magnified in the region, and recognizing that ESG reporting requirements mean that companies must now be more intentional about meeting their ESG goals. Our definitions of sustainable financing and the criteria for the companies we do businesses, including our due diligence processes on potential investors and our documentary requirements, ought to change to ensure that they align with and are reflective of our own national environmental, social, and governance priorities. We must be cognizant that some companies come to our region seeking investment opportunities with the full knowledge that our regulatory frameworks are often less robust, still in its infancy stage, or not yet entrenched, particularly in the case of ESG legislation. Many engage in greenwashing and have superficial appearance of sustainability, but this does not translate to their operations. The fact that global ESG legislative framework exists means that companies have an obligation to report. So even if certain information is requested by us without our ESG legislation being operationalized, it should, in principle, be readily available to us. However, there's another side to this. With the right partnerships and willingness on both sides, our challenge is to also present an opportunity for companies to meet their ESG targets. With the increasing pressure and demand on our limited financial resources, oftentimes these issues that require long-term solutions are placed on the back burner with a shift in focus to more immediate needs with visible results. This means that more times than we probably care to admit, environmental management and climate change resilience programs, for example, are under-resourced. Therefore, marine protected areas and management of our marine protected areas, building coastal resilience, protection of our coral reefs and building coral nurseries, access to affordable water and affordable energy are all often under-resourced. Addressing these issues requires significant resources that we don't always readily have access to. However, by including a more comprehensive sustainability matrix in our investment policies, we can ensure that investors provide information on their existing ESG compliance, demonstrate in their project plans with how their business operates on ESG pillars and how it is incorporated in their daily operations, commit to investing in national projects and programs, and include ESG as a key performance indicator in their investment agreements with government. giving both the investors and the government an opportunity to meet their respective climate, resilience, social, and governance goals. But while we look outward, we also have to look inward. We must consider practices of our local business communities as well, and how we can bring them along. By way of example, in January of this year, my ministry launched an environmental stewardship program for tourism-based businesses. Recognizing the importance of environmental protection and the need for government and private sector collaboration to maintain healthy ecosystems, the program aims to encourage tourism-based businesses to be good environmental stewards. Businesses participating in this program are eligible to receive a seal of environmental stewardship from the ministry that can be displayed on their website, their marketing material, and is a tangible acknowledgement of the business's commitment to management practices, green operations, support of local communities and national environmental efforts, coastal and terrestrial management, and disaster resilience. We have adopted a soft approach, so the program is not mandatory. However, we believe that this is a necessary step to ensuring that our business community begins to include sustainability considerations in their everyday operations. This way, as we eventually transition to ESG legislative frameworks, our policy context and business environment will have the experience to support that transition in the future. But we still have a long way to go, and we have not yet given active consideration to ESG legislation. But being fully cognizant about what is happening in the global sphere, there is no reason why sustainable development policies cannot begin to be incorporated and elements of the ESG also being incorporated in our policies and guide our engagement with potential investors, as I have previously outlined. And we in Angola, we stand to believe that if sustainability is our goal, then ESG has to be embraced as a platform on which it can be achieved. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister. Really insightful to hear that last comment, that if sustainability is your goal, it needs to stand on a platform and a base of ESG. Really appreciated hearing that. And also the collaboration that seems to be happening at arm's length across the islands. So moving on to our next speaker, I'm happy to introduce, which will be Rachel Welch Phillips, who is a partner in Denton's Trinidad and Tobago. She is head of the ESG and Sustainable Finance Practice and a member of the Regional Corporate and Commercial Practice Group. She focuses on ESG strategy and compliance, mergers and acquisitions, commercial contract drafting and negotiation, project development, debt financing, and regulatory advice across a variety of industry sectors. Rachel holds an undergraduate degree in environmental policy and a master's of philosophy from the University of Cambridge in environmental policy. And Rachel also has a deep passion for assisting clients on their ESG journeys, both internal and client-facing. And she's assisted clients across Europe with access to ESG financing, developing internal ESG strategies, complying with the ESG regulatory landscape in Europe. And she's also embedded their ESG goals into commercial and procurement contracts. So now that she's returned home to Trinidad, she's an active public speaker in the ESG space, and she's eager to assist in the national and regional discourse and to assist businesses and regulatory bodies with accelerating progress in this space. So welcome, Rachel. Looking forward to hearing more from you.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone from around the world who's tuned in. It's a great honor to be here and to be joined by my fellow panelists, the honorable ministers and senators that you have heard from. As Joanna said, I work in the ESG space across the region. And there's one thing that has been very evident in my work here so far, which is that there's often a conflation of terms in this space that results in a lack of clarity. So I'm just going to take a moment to, in very simple and plain terms, describe what I'm referring to when I speak to ESG and what the differences are between that and sustainable development policy and how they can be linked. So ESG regulation and legislation is emerging around the world. We are seeing it in Europe at its most advanced, where legislation has come into play mandating certain disclosures of information in the categories of environment, social, and governance impact. We are also seeing Slowly and in a less comprehensive manner, in the United States, the Securities and Exchange Commission has released proposed legislation as well, not yet in force, but proposed rules around disclosure of environmental impacts, specifically climate change disclosures on greenhouse gas emissions. Even though it is focused on that scope, the breadth of it is actually the most deep breadth we've seen so far in this space, in that the US SEC is going to capture scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions in their rules as they stand now. All of that is fantastic to see, but it's important that we understand what ESG regulation is mandating: information. It is mandating within the private sector that companies disclose. It is not actually telling them to do anything. So the premise behind ESG is to regulate a space that CSR had intended to promote. That space was responsible corporate citizenry. The definition of sustainability in the Brundtland Commission, as we know, is allowing meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. So what that means is we need to find a way to ensure, and policy is the way to do that. It's the way to ensure and make predictable behaviors that are in the best interests of a nation. We need to use policy as a tool to ensure that we are meeting our needs today without compromising the ability of future generations to meet theirs. Now, sustainable development policy can take many, many different forms. It can address many, many different things. Any one of the 17 SDGs or any combination of them would amount to sustainable development policy. But thus far, we have seen very little sustainable development policy globally that in fact incorporates the ESG framework: disclosure of information. So really what we should be seeing ESG as is a tool. ESG is a very, very helpful tool to allow for the quantification of impact that will reveal whether or not our sustainable development policies are producing the desired effects. The private sector has a very, very important role to play in a nation's ability to meet its SDG goals. But how do we know whether we are making the progress that we are hoping we're making if we implement policy in the absence of an ESG framework? How can we quantify the impact of that policy? How can we quantify the source of improvements or the source of progress, or where progress is lacking, if we do not mandate that the participants in the nation, who are the primary source of the impact, disclose that information openly? ESG is often seen as a form of risk framework, and that's because of its history. ESG was born in the United Nations. In fact, it's a term that is born in the United Nations in their principles of responsible investment. Yeah, so the E, the S, and the G categories came into play as a way for the investment community to assess the companies in which it's putting its money, or the projects in which it's putting its money. That then it then evolved on a macro scale to use these criteria as a form of assessing a company's performance. In the investment and asset management and wealth community, that was used to understand whether or not a dollar invested was a dollar that was doing good. They were using that as a way to assess a company's resilience as well. So is the company able to withstand the inevitable climate change impacts that we are seeing because of past behavior? Is the company able to withstand the introduction of new legislation on matters of corporate governance? You know, what is that company's ability to survive, right? What is that company's ability to meet its current needs without compromising its ability to meet future needs? How viable is that company's proposition? That's what ESG was born of. Now, that approach can be taken and applied outside of the investment community. We can use it in the finance community, we can, in the retail banking community, we can use it in the policy community. In fact, we can use it in any community, because what it's asking is, what is the impact of this operation on people and the planet? Now, if we asked all companies, what is the impact of your revenue generation on people and the planet, we are going a step further than CSR ever went. We are not allowing ESG to be philanthropized or be placed in an HR department and then form part of a company's charitable or philanthropic efforts. What we're saying is, the money that you're making is having an impact, and you need to disclose that impact. That will empower governments, customers, stakeholders of all kinds, including investors, with the information they need to know where their spend should be directed, where behavior might need to be corrected, and what the correct approach is to where the true impact is emanating from. That information truly is power. And as one of the honorable ministers pointed out, what gets measured gets managed. And if we're not measuring, then it is really a futile effort to try to manage what we are not fully informed on. So ESG legislation should really be viewed as an instrumental tool in the development of sustainable development policy. It is not a one-size-fits-all approach, but in the Caribbean region, as the ministers pointed out already, there's a lot of cohesion. There's a lot of ability to collaborate because we are suffering from a lot of the same struggles. We are facing a lot of the same challenges, and there's a great opportunity for us to come together to do things in a synchronous fashion that will allow us greater access to the finance community, to the liquidity that's out there, to the impact investment community, for example, to the ESG investment community abroad and within our own region. That is what will really advance our ability to quantify and mandate continued progress towards the SDGs in the Caribbean. I look forward to all your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel. And also appreciate you setting the context, providing some definitions around the terms ESG, as development, sustainable development, and more. We were hoping that Minister Samuda would have been able to join us at this stage, but he has not yet joined the chat, if I'm not mistaken. So what we will do, oh, there he is.
Yeah.
You are? Yes. Okay, fantastic. So I will jump straight into your Minister Samuda. Thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it. So what we will do, I'll just quickly give you an introduction. Matthew Samuda, the Honorable Matthew Samuda, currently serves as the Minister without portfolio in the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation in Jamaica. So he's been assigned responsibilities for water, environment, climate change, and the blue and green economies. He had the honor of serving Jamaica through his appointment to the cabinet, which is the executive arm of the state, and that had followed his appointment to the upper house as a senator. Now, over the years, he's been very consistent in abiding by the principle of environmental preservation and protection. And in 2016, he led the tabling of a private member's motion in the Jamaican Parliament, which resulted in the ban on single-use plastic and styrofoam in 2019. In March 2015, Minister Samuda was offered the opportunity to occupy the prestigious post of President of Generation 2000, or G2K, which is the young professional affiliate of the Jamaica Labour Party. And he served with a clear commitment to being a voice for the younger generation while making a positive difference both on the Jamaica Labour Party, the JLP, and most importantly for Jamaica overall. Previously, Minister Samuda oversaw the social media marketing efforts for the JLP, G2K, and the Most Honorable Andrew Holness, the Prime Minister of Jamaica. Thank you so much, Minister Samuda. We look forward to hearing your contribution and learning more about what's happening on the ground in Jamaica.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you to the entire Island Innovation team. Allow me to also acknowledge colleague ministers from the region on the call, and apologies for being late. Greetings to everyone who is listening. I think a good place to start from is to acknowledge that climate change is no longer a matter for the distant future. We're already experiencing the impacts that will no doubt grow exponentially in the absence of bolder action. Recently, the sixth assessment report from the IPCC has warned that the next 3 years represent the last window for us to ensure the 1.5 degree target and the Paris Agreement stays in sight. The challenge for us small island developing nations is being on the front lines of a crisis, not of our making, not one that we have the capacity to adapt to within our own economic circumstances. We are the ones forced to pay an economic and social price beyond our ability. Jamaica's economic growth and social development are already being impacted by significant droughts, floods, tropical storms, and hurricanes. With 90% of our GDP being produced in our coastal regions, which is where 70% of our population live, it should be no secret as to why the issue of climate change is real. What is often not discussed in the context of the ESG framework and its absolute need for an ESG framework is indeed the fact that slow onset events are already ravaging our respective economies, certainly as small island states. Slow onset events generally triggered by slow sea level rise include saltwater intrusion in our wells, soil quality deterioration, reduction in pollination rates from marginal heating of the air. We are already experiencing the deleterious economic and social effects of all of these issues. Now, the ESG framework and how it interacts between governments and private sector is an interesting concept, and I'm happy for the discussion to discuss this today. The general theme, I think, represents how Jamaica has tried to approach its regulatory, policy, and legislative framework. And I believe that has borne some fruit, whereas I believe in some areas we are indeed behind. Jamaica is actively pursuing several coastal revetment projects that, create social good, but also protect us against sea level rise. We are actively pursuing projects that reforest areas that have been degraded in the past. That is a part of our 3 million tree planting initiative, which should come to completion this year. We are actively pursuing several restoration efforts for mangroves, for forests that have been damaged by climatic events, especially along our south coast. But these are activities that require the right framework if we're to enjoy the true benefits of our nation for generations to come. That framework is one that I will spend a little time on now, if so pleases moderator. Jamaica has a Clean Air Act that was passed in 1964, and Jamaica has a Natural Resources Conservation Authority Act, which was passed in 1991. Most of the environmental regulatory framework is anchored in regulations which are within these two pieces of legislation. Outside of that, we've passed a raft of new policy initiatives in recent times, which we think contributes to the strength of our ESG framework. One is a new climate change policy. This outlines very clearly how Jamaica intends to mitigate against its emissions, adapt, and how it intends to engage the international community and put its voice forward. We've also passed a new emissions policy, which deals with the critical issue of air pollution, which is obviously a close cousin of climate change. We've also passed a new watersheds policy, and we are in the process of completing a new Forestry Act. All of this modernizes the legislative and policy framework within the Jamaican context to ensure that we have the right mix of legislative processes. Now, the government's ESG framework and the issue around accountability and transparency, I think, is at the core of how companies function and how governments should function. Jamaica has Access to Information Act, which guarantees citizens the right to ask their government and any ministry, department, and agency for information. And the government is legislated to respond, I believe, within 30 days. Now, this is an important piece of legislation. It represents the Jamaican government's commitment and legislated commitment to transparency. There is a particular agreement, which I think is very important for the ESG framework, and the government that is serious about the ESG framework should aspire to, if not comply with, and that's the Escazú Agreement. The Escazú Agreement is not one that the Jamaican government has completed, but we are working to complete because it does require some legislative change, not least of all in the ATI Act, which would require us to change that act to 15 days. Our primary issue with the Escazú Agreement has been around this point, because to comply with transparency requirements in 30 to 15 days will require more resources for us not just to sign, but to actually be able to comply with what we are agreeing to. It is our intention. We are working to getting to that point, and we think we'll be much closer to that very, very soon. We were the 11th country to submit our updated NDCs. We have played a very active role in the discussions so far, leading up to the structure of the INC for the plastic treaty. Our national adaptation plans are in. Obviously, not much less rushed environment. I could go through significantly more that we've done, but I think that's a good place to start. And I hope I've shared a little bit of what Jamaica is doing to comply with the intent of the ESG framework.
Oh, thank you very much, Minister Samuda. Really comprehensive and really looking forward to hearing more. I'd actually like to invite all of the panelists to just come back on camera now. We'll be covering some of the questions that were laid out in the Q&A. And just a reminder to everyone on the call, on the webinar, if you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A. Please give your name as well and where you're from so that we're able to address them appropriately as opposed to in the webinar chat. But the first question is one that is more targeted at the huge differences. I mean, just listening to you this morning, we recognize that there's huge differences in policy across the region. And just from these four islands that we've heard from, wanted to get an understanding, and Minister Samuda, since you were the last on, and I'd also like to hear from the others as well afterwards, given these huge differences in policy, what coordination is currently happening on the regional level, whether it's via CARICOM, the OECS, or other regional bodies? Wanted to get a bit of an understanding because this was also mentioned by Dr. Clark and Minister Gums when they were talking about collaboration is key. What is your knowledge of what's happening right now with respect to collaboration? And Minister Samuda, if you don't have an immediate response, I'd also like to invite Ministers Clark and Gums-Marie to share as well their perspectives.
So I didn't realize that the question was directed at me. No, the initial response is that there is, I think, good collaboration through the CARICOM Climate Change Center. I think that's a good point of commencement. Is there sufficient interaction, partnership, and coordination? Not in my opinion. I think there's always the opportunity for us to work closer together because there's significant benefit, especially as we go to multilaterals, to be on the same page and sing from the same hymn book. But I think there is some, but there's always benefit for improvement.
Okay, thank you. Minister Clark.
Right. I'd like to echo the sentiments of my colleague minister. It's true that we do have some overarching collaboration, some levels through CARICOM and even for St. Kitts and Nevis and the other members of the OECS, there is collaboration there, especially as it relates to legislation. However, we don't often show up in the same international spaces with the same agenda. And that's because we don't get the collaboration for, just modeling best practices and being able to support the agendas of various countries, like the Bridgetown Agenda, for example.
Like the Bridgetown Agenda, excellent. Minister Gums-Marie, is there anything that you're seeing that's happening with collaboration from Anguilla and your side of the Caribbean?
Well, I think that there is an attempt to have proper collaboration, and you see that there's more collaborations also with our interregional organizations such as CARICOM, OECS, and all of the other organizations that exist in the region. However, I do think there's a level of fragmentation, particularly as it relates to dependent territories. I think many persons often forget that we are left on the periphery and don't have the benefit of representing ourselves in certain spheres. And as a result, our needs, which are very similar, and while they may be unique aspects of it, they're very similar to what is happening across the region, are oftentimes under the radar, and we only get the benefit of collaborating with our UK counterparts. And only when we get invited to regional organizations through our currency unions, such as ECCB or the OECS, we have an opportunity to have that level of representation. But even as it stands, we're not full members of CARICOM, so we don't get the full benefit of having that level of representation. So I think there needs to be we need to democratize the approach to regional representation and ensure that when we do have that level of representation, it not just happens when we go out to the Western world to present our agenda, that we talk amongst ourselves more often. I think it's only sometimes when we get in forums like this, when we hear each other talk about our unique problems, we realize that they are actually very shared and quite common across the region.
Absolutely. Rachel, I'm going to ask you now to share a little bit about your experience in Europe with this element of collaboration and sharing of information and knowledge.
Yeah, well, the European Union have it really easy. Yeah, they're a union. They legislate together. They have to then, implement at the national level, but they have a structure in place that we have not replicated or do not have a comparable version of at this time. But I don't think that is necessarily the only answer. As my peers have already mentioned, there are unique challenges, but I think there are certain things that if the islands were to come together and agree on, for example, urgency, funding, even if the islands took disparate approaches based on their own national interests, needs, and agendas, there is still a need for collaboration on this idea of how can we help each other, right? The crisis is all our making, and we're all going to be impacted by it. So how can we work together and standardize the approach? Because that is a cost-efficient thing to do, but it's also a way for the region to develop together. We are very small islands, and volumes are always going to be a problem when it comes to, for example, pipeline financing, right? Because if we don't have the volume of projects available, and as a region can't come together and say, hey, look, we can have one organization present itself that's going to be doing things on multiple islands because there's a regulatory framework that allows it across those multiple islands, all of a sudden we start attracting finance, and the liquidity all of a sudden becomes more and more available. But that being said, there's also a role for the private sector in this form of collaboration. So, for example, we're seeing regulators moving in this space a little quicker than the conventional legislative process. So you might see stock exchanges starting to discuss ESG disclosure requirements for its members. What that means in the Caribbean is that a company headquartered here in Trinidad that is listed in Jamaica now has compliance requirements, right, regardless of where it sits. So again, that is going to force certain behaviors. And as that happens, there is going to be a regional impact, hopefully, and what I predict is that will have a knock-on effect. It'll take one stock exchange to start the wave, and then other stock exchange will get on board, because what they'll see is that a lot of the companies listed across multiple islands will be compliant anyway and can start to drive that. But the other thing that will be driven by this sort of first mover approach is the capacity building. The Caribbean currently lacks the capacity to assist companies in ESG compliance. We do not have a very well-developed service industry for data gathering, quantification, carbon accounting, social impact assessment, all these things. For example, in Trinidad, we can see the social impact assessment sphere is a little more developed because our oil and gas industry has had it mandated on them for a while now, right? So there are areas where we can just continue to develop it or create a more comprehensive approach to something that we already have. But the reality is the capacity right now is not there for wide-scale ESG compliance. It cannot be something that is mandated in the absence of the resources and tools needed to do it properly and to do it effectively. So capacity building is really, again, a private sector initiative that we need to grow, but it needs to be supported by regulation that will allow, for example, why not, government ministers think about some tax breaks for the sector, or, whatever tools are in the arsenal of the politicians to encourage behavior. And that can be considered a part of sustainable development policy, right? Part of our policy is to increase the capacity building and create the service sector to meet ESG requirements.
I think thank you for that, Rachel. I think that actually answers one of the first questions we had from Marius Panahan, which is, to what extent can ESG considerations be used to address systemic challenges such as income inequality, poverty, and climate change? Throwing that question then out to potentially Minister Clark, because you mentioned having to think about how do we protect the most vulnerable. What other strategies do you think you can employ to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals using ESG considerations? Minister Clark.
Right, and thank you for that question. And I'll reference a conversation I had yesterday with the head of our Citizen by Investment Unit, Investment Migration. And I referenced the call I had, the Zoom call I had today, and I said, just thinking out loud, do you think we would ever get to a point where we tell persons interested in our Citizen by Investment program that we are only accepting clientele who either one are interested in sustainable investment portfolio here in St. Kitts and Nevis, or can we even go as far as saying issuing our passport is based on whether or not your wealth was derived from, depending on how your wealth was derived. And he laughed and he said, in an ideal world, we would want to say that we're only working with investors who are very careful about inclusivity and diversity and corporate governance and environmental conservation. But when you are a cash-strapped or cash-poor country, or you have a growing debt to GDP ratio, where can you have that conversation? And it really starts with the awareness building in St. Kitts and Nevis and intentional steps towards educating the public about the need to protect the most vulnerable, as we're doing with a revamp of our education program. And also, as a government, being intentional about aging and disability, about transforming gender protection and the gender ministry, or saying, we need a climate action ministry, and climate action is linked to constituency empowerment and how we empower the most vulnerable in our society. So it's our own obligation as a country, but it's also recognizing where we are when we can't bargain with investors and persons who are going to bring their money and their wealth to St. Kitts. We want to get to that position and want to ensure that our policy and our development is based on that. But until we get there, we do what we can in St. Kitts and Nevis.
Excellent. All right, the next question, I'm going to be coming to you, Minister Gums-Marie. We have a question from Dr. Michelle McLeod. What has been the effectiveness of tourism taxation policy in island finance? And Minister Gums-Marie, if you do have tourism tax in place, I know that also Jamaica potentially also does. So Minister Samuda, will come to you next with that same question. But Minister Gums-Marie, what has been the effectiveness of tourism taxation policy in island finance?
Well, we don't have any taxation policies that are specific to tourism, although they are broad-based taxes that touch tourism naturally. What we do is levels of incentives to attract tourism-based foreign direct investment for economic activity. And what we have been doing is becoming more, to use the Honorable Dr. Clark's word, intentional with how we interact with our potential investors, because we're realizing that there are many persons who would like to utilize the region for their advantage. And we must now become very bold in who we say have access to us, because we don't want to be viewed as a free-for-all. And in the way we reject certain kinds of financial opportunities, while they may seem on the face of it robust and would be good for government coffers, what are the social consequences and the social costs and the environmental consequences and the environmental costs? And we have found a level of empowerment from the government level in saying no. There is lots of finance opportunities out there, and there's also with that lots of piracy. And as we move towards adopting the Sustainable Development Goals, there are people who utilize the language of sustainability and cloak themselves in the image of a company that is sustainable and here for good use. And when you do investigation, when you see the suggestions they put forward in their memorandums of understanding, you realize this is not the making of a country that concerns itself with sustainable development. It does not concern itself with development of host communities. And that is the kind of partnerships we are looking at. We are no longer looking at foreign direct investment as only money into government coffers so that we can put into something else. Because what you'd realize, if you're not intentional, if you don't empower yourself with the reality that you can say no, is that you will be giving government money, and that same money that you receive, you're putting it back into paying for the social consequences. And so we are trying to balance the scales and bring along more arms to look at investment beyond just the Ministry of Finance. We're bringing on my Ministry of Sustainability. We're bringing on the Ministry of Housing and infrastructure development. We're bringing on the Ministry of Labor so that we can have a more robust idea of what we want and telling businesses, if you come to Anguilla, you know that we have our beaches, we are a high-end tourism destination. It also means giving our people an opportunity for managerial positions, and not just taken from the I'm looking at the time. I know that you probably want to get to Minister Samuda, but not just taken from our communities and taken from our environment and benefiting from the stewardship that we have done in the past to give you something to benefit from, but also building on our communities and our environment.
Thank you very much. Over to you, Minister Samuda. Your thoughts on...
So I agree with Minister Gomes-Marie. I mean, we've been approaching investors very differently in recent times. It's impatient to debate that right throughout the region. Some investors from decades ago have benefited way more than our citizens and way more than our governments. In the Jamaican context, certainly in the tourism context, Jamaica does have a room tax, which I believe is very similar to that of St. Lucia and that of the Cayman Islands, in terms of we've actually tried to keep them, keep some parity in that regard. We also have the flyover fees for all the airlines that go through our space, and we have robust fees and penalties and monitoring of ships that come into our waters, whether for tourism or for logistics, as we do have a pretty expansive logistics industry that we think is kind of in many ways where the economy is going. Where we haven't done well, and where I think rightfully as a state, and I mean the government, regardless of administration, criticized by citizens, has been our management of the extractive industries, certainly mining. And this is more of a long-term issue than a current issue, because now you have intent meeting long-term contracts, which is not always a easy thing to bring together for a small economy or in any negotiation, which is why dealing with investors up front and creating the right framework for them at the very beginning is very important, because you also don't want a loss of trust within the international markets in terms of looking at you as an investment destination. But I think we've done relatively well over the last 10 or so years as we've expanded our room stock in tourism, as we've expanded our airlift and our connectivity by way of cruise passengers. We still have a way to go, but the area is a little more regulated than they would like, and I think we've been putting a lot more into enforcement. But we do have work to do in other areas, certainly in logistics and mining, to ensure that we are in line with best practices.
No, thank you very much, Minister Samuda. And I wish we had another hour to go through all of the wonderful questions that have come through. But I definitely do want to thank all of the panelists for sharing the thoughts on not just from their own experience in their country, but from further afield. And I'll hand back over now to James to close the session. But we want to thank you all for participating. Thank you for your questions. And we look forward to having this conversation continue in all of the new forums that we are hoping to set up where we can collaborate. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Joanna, for that fantastic session. And thank you so much again to Minister Clark, Minister Gomes-Marie, Minister Samuda, and Rachel Phillips for the fantastic insights. We need to, I think, rewatch this session to digest everything that was said there. We have another session that may be of interest to many of you in 1 hour's time. 1 hour and a half's time. Blue and green economy investment opportunities for Caribbean SIDS. So a fantastic panel with speakers from St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Lucia, and other parts of the region. So I do hope you'll be able to join us for that. Thank you again for everyone for joining this session, and enjoy the rest of your day.